Hey everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. We are about halfway through our program of events. That's 43 events. So by my count, we should have something like 20 events left. We have 110, 113 speakers, something like that. It's really an amazing program. I'm going to clue you into the next few events that are up. So you won't miss something that you really want to see. Now, tomorrow, we have at 11 a.m. A conversation between Sandro Mazzadra in Italy and Jason Reed in Maine. It's called Marx Producing Subjects. They never talked before. They admire each other's works. I'm really looking forward to it. At 6 p.m., How to Weaponize or Diffuse a Constitution. We have Aziz Rana and Camila Vergara, who are both authors of great new books on the problem of constitutions. And Camila, in fact, is also Chilean, so she has something to cheer about that we can talk. Richard Kreitner will also be on. He's the author of Break It Up, a history of succession in the United States, or what happens when constitutions don't work. It could also be called dual power, we'll see. That's at 6 p.m. tomorrow night. On Friday at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, Lux, starting a socialist feminist women's magazine, with Sarah Leonard, Marion Jones, Tammy Kim, Cheryl Rivera, and Sharanya Durvasula. And at 6 p.m., we have Theorizing the Present, the Revolutionary Foresight of Black Communist Women, with Charisse Burden-Stelly and Jody Dean, Ashley Farmer as the moderator. And what do we have Saturday morning? We have something good on Saturday, I think. Yes, and even relevant. Spectre Journal, the new Life magazine that's on its third issue, I think, presents class struggle and racial justice after the union drive at Amazon in Alabama. Sigh. But Donna Murch and Michael Goldfield and David McNally will analyze why it happened and hopefully leave us fired up to organize the next Amazon. We will see. How do we do a festival this large? We do not have any institutional funding, as you might imagine. Any festival with a slogan like "Be a commie for a month," the trouble it would have it getting funding in America. So we have to appeal to you. Depend on the kindness of strangers. You can donate to us by going to our website, www.redmayseattle.org. You'll find a link to a GoFundMe, or you can become a patron in Patreon, $3, $5, $10, $20 levels. Anything you can afford will help us out. We also need volunteers, so you can find a place for that on our website. Next year, we hope to go back to doing the festival live. This is our 5th year, amazing, and the last 2 have been online. So I'll believe it when we're all outside walking in the Marxathon down Pine Street, carrying our red flags and flicking our thumbs at Amazon. We will see. At any rate, now to the main event today. The event is called, what is it? It's the Asset Economy and the Logic of Speculation. We have a wonderful series of discussants, very awkward sentence, which I fell into because I started it the wrong way. Martijn Konings is professor of political economy and social theory at the University of Sydney. He's the author of The Development of American Finance, The Emotional Logic of Capitalism, Neoliberalism with Damon Cahill, Capital and Time, and co-author of The Asset Economy with Lisa Adkins and Melinda Cooper. Lisa Adkins, the co-author, is also here. She's professor of sociology and head of the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney. Her contributions to the discipline of sociology are in the areas of economics, sociology, social theory, and feminist theory. And she's the author of The Time of Money in 2018, the post-Fordist sexual contract, working and living in contingency, and also Measure and Value, and editor-in-chief of the journal Australian Feminist Studies. So I joke that I had begun to think of them as belonging to, I call them the Sydney tendency, with their partner in crime, Melinda and Cooper, and then decided that that sounded like a hip deli in Beverly Hills, so I wouldn't do that. But I became aware of their work shortly, well, I guess 5 years after the financial crisis, when they took over an issue of South Atlantic Quarterly and had an introduction, and Melinda and Martin wrote an introduction called Contingency and Foundation, two very important words we want to get back to discuss. Rethinking money, debt, and finance after the crisis. And by the time I hit this phrase, capital's simultaneously tendency towards speculative expansion and austere refoundation, I was hooked. And when they started talking about speculative austerity, I knew I wanted to know more about this. So I've since sought out all their books and read them, and the variety of topics that they consider is absolutely astounding. The contributions in creating a more nuanced view of neoliberalism, or why, particularly why neoliberalism might be welcomed by a lot of people, what sort of effective logics it works on, and it's their critique of a kind of moralized narrative of embedding and disembedding that comes from a kind of a dumbed down Karl Polanyi, and their critique of moralized critiques of finance as parasitic, because of course finance has been around since the beginning of capitalism. The number of insights and roads that they open up in their work is just astounding. So rather than throw out superlatives for the next 10 minutes and bore you to tears, I'm going to give you the genuine article themselves. I think Martin is going to talk first, and Martin and Lisa are going to each talk about their latest book with Melinda Cooper, The Asset Economy and the Logic of Speculation. And then we will go into, open out into all of their work from there. And Steve Shaviro is also my co-partner in crime. Oh, Steve, I haven't introduced you. He's the D. Roy Professor of English at Wayne State University, author of many things like Doom Patrols, The Cinematic Body. I'm talking about the old days when Stephen was in Seattle. He's a critic of science fiction, of God, I'm lost. Author of, is it Discognition? Is that the name? He's a new book called Extreme Fabulations, Science Fictions of Life, which is available in August 2021 from Goldsmiths Press, and an old friend from Seattle. So onward we go to, let's start with Martin.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for that very generous introduction, and very, very excited to be here at this very inspiring event. I can only imagine what the real world version would look like. So I definitely hope to make it to that next year. But yeah, I'll talk for about brief introduction to sort of the book, and then I'll pass to Lisa, and then things will unfold from there. So I just want to start by briefly talking about what it means to talk about an asset economy, which is the title of our latest book. So we're quite used to thinking that there's something like a regular or a real economy, which is governed by like fundamental values, and that this is different from a financial sector or an asset economy. And the premise of the book is that this distinction between a real and a financial economy, between a foundational and an asset economy, is less and less useful. The asset economy isn't just this separate sphere of high finance. It's something that shapes how contemporary societies, at the very least, Western contemporary societies, work at their very core. So the book dialogues quite a bit with Thomas Piketty's famous book, Capital in the 21st Century. And that book, has done a lot to put inequality back on the agenda, also recognizes the centrality of the growth of asset prices. But the story that Piketty tells is one of the runaway growth of wealth at the very top. It's the story of the 1%. And, we acknowledge that that is a very real phenomenon. But in a number of discussions, it's often not clear how this 1% trend is able to continue in spite of our growing awareness of it. Piketty's own explanation here is that, the past decades have seen the growth of this plutocracy, concentration of political and policy influence in the hands of, that group of, the very wealthy financiers. And that is certainly part of what's going on, like corruption and that kind of direct political influence. They're very real things. But the explanation also begs key questions like, why do electorates keep voting governments into office that facilitate all this, the asset inflation and the wealth concentration? So the story we're saying is a bit more complicated than indicated by Piketty. What we need to understand is a wider or more general transformation of how inequality works. And in the book, we say that the role of housing here has become key. So neoliberalism as a project has gone through a series of attempts to turn ordinary people into capitalists, to bring capital gains into the reach of ordinary people. Human capital, pension fund capitalism, those kinds of things. But it's really only in the area of housing that this has stuck to some degree, that it's achieved some practical plausibility. Now, of course, the flip side of that relative success is that in many large cities, property prices are now at levels that make it virtually impossible to buy a home on the basis of a salary, a wage alone. And that is why we argue that asset prices, property prices, have become the linchpin of a new logic of inequality. So taken by itself, income from employment is less and less able to serve, as what we might think of as a middle-class lifestyle. And this, of course, has a key generational aspect. Increasingly, it's only inheritance or an advanced inheritance of some sort that can help people buy into the property market. So by using this term, the asset economy, we're trying to draw attention to the fact that asset inflation is not something that is happening elsewhere in the sphere of high finance. It's a process that we're all exposed to the effects of that process, either through inclusion or exclusion. And there's a political point to that as well, shifting our focus from the 1% to that broader asset economy allows us to understand a bit better why governments pretty much across the Anglo-capitalist world have stuck with these policies that continuously prop up asset values, even though we now know how harmful it is. And the reason is that politicians, policymakers, governments find it very difficult not to cater to some extent to this constituency of homeowners who, have a vested interest in property inflation. And these points then open out onto some more conceptual questions. So basically what we're saying is that the key element that shapes inequality is less and less employment and more whether you're able to participate in asset inflation, whether you're able to buy assets that appreciate at a faster rate than either inflation or wages. And so in order to understand that better, in the book, we shift the focus from, focus of analysis from the commodity to the asset. So critiques of neoliberal capitalism tend to focus on commodification as the key problem and the key trend of neoliberal capitalism. And what we're saying is that the commodity is just at this point, an inherently anachronistic lens through which to understand contemporary capitalism. Marx looked at the commodity in order to understand a specific kind of exploitation. We're trying to capture different mechanisms of exploitation and inequality production. And then as a last point, I'd just like to bring in Minsky here, because we work out some of these ideas through a reappropriation of Hyman Minsky's work. So the Hyman Minsky that became famous after the global financial crisis of 2007-8 is very much known as a critic of over-indebtedness, too much speculative capital floating around in relation to the real value produced in the real economy. And that leads to very moralizing assessments that understand finance as unproductive, speculative, etc. And so we appropriate Minsky in a different way. Our point is that we do not have a debt economy as such. We also have that, but fundamentally it's more an asset economy where the value of the underlying asset is not stable, but itself very highly malleable. And then the key issue really shifts from one of concerns with real or fundamental value and whether finance is in tune with that or not, towards the more basic issue of liquidity. Which is key to Minsky's thinking. And liquidity really refers to the ability to, stay in the game for long enough that you can capture capital gains. It's firstly the ability to not be forced to make bad choices. So in the book, we think about what we call Minskyan households, households who need to maintain payments, regular payments, on what are often massive debts, in order to hold on to an asset that is likely to appreciate in value over time. And whether people are able to do that or not is like a key dividing line in contemporary society. And it's again, what produces this constant pressure on politicians, policymakers to keep asset inflation going. There's that critical, politically critical middle class constituency that doesn't have that much financial leeway, in contrast to the story of the 1%. Okay, so those are some of the points I wanted to quickly make, and I'll pass over to Lisa now.
Thanks so much, Martin, and thanks so much, Phil, for your very generous introduction. So just to build on some of the points that Martin has made and hopefully open this up further for discussion. So as Martin noted, we've become really familiar and very used to thinking about inequalities of wealth as being really all about the super rich or the 1%. And over the COVID period, we've seen that with lots of stories floating around of increases in sales in super yachts and all sorts of things. But in our book, we were really focused on how the logics of property price appreciation and wage depreciation, those two processes operating together simultaneously, how those operate society-wide. So we really wanted to understand the asset economy as being a social logic, rather than just as being delimited to either a certain top fraction of the society or a certain part of the economy. And we try to show in the book how those logics have been at work over the past 4 decades. And over the same time period, how successive Anglo-capitalist governments, and the cases we draw on in the book of the UK, Australia and the US, have encouraged, propped up and rewarded credit-driven residential property ownership. And of course, that culmination of forces, as we all know, has meant that home ownership during a certain period expanded quite dramatically, and that property prices increased, with many property owning households seeing actually quite major gains in their household wealth portfolios. So there was, in other words, for a short time period, an apparent democratization of the wealth effect of asset ownership. But the very logic of credit-driven home purchases, of course, as we all know now, pushed house prices up to heights where it became increasingly difficult for people to enter into the market. And price inflation over time has meant that in many large cities, so Sydney, Seattle included, it's now virtually impossible to enter the property market just on the basis of an average wage. And as a consequence, private rental markets have expanded and rents have also risen dramatically. And renters, of course, aren't simply locked out of home ownership, but also from the wealth effects that home ownership generates. So one of our key concerns in the book then was to point out how a rift has opened up between those with and without housing assets. And that doesn't just simply entail differences in wealth accumulation, but also in life chances. So we're really interested in the book in thinking about the asset economy from a life course perspective as well, to think about how the asset economy is actually actively restructuring people's lifetimes and the way they can live their lives. So, and what's become apparent is that the asset economy has fundamentally reworked or restructured what sociologists call patterns of class or social stratification. And what this means in practice is that even though people might have similar jobs and earn the same wages, deep inequalities can exist between the same people who, depending on whether or not they own assets or not. And of course, this makes a major difference or marks a major shift in the type of society that we're living in, given that historically in the Keynesian era, for example, life chances were very much tied to jobs and to occupations. Now, these trends have become really notable among younger generations, where they've given rise to stark new forms of inequality. And in fact, in recent years, there's been a real outpouring of publications arguing that a kind of lockout from home ownership is taking place along generational lines. According to this story, the millennial generation in particular has been priced out of home ownership and from the benefits of asset appreciation. But what we highlight in the book is that story misses intergenerational dynamics. We argue that what distinguishes successive generations today is a difference in modes of access to wealth. So while older baby boomer generations were in a much better position to buy property through their wages alone, younger generations are increasingly dependent on the ability and willingness of their parents to lend them or give them money for a deposit in order to enter the housing market. Those who are set to inherit housing assets or whose access to parental wealth offers a route into home ownership are then distinctively advantaged. Via inheritance and wealth transfers, which are increasing, by the way, in a quantitative sense, those transfers, those privileged cohorts are offered participation in property-based asset inflation and capital gains. And we all know, of course, that inheritance has served historically as a really critical mechanism for the transfer of private wealth from one generation to the next. And that's happened especially historically for the very wealthiest. But what we try to show in the book is that in the asset economy, where the holding of assets is a key determinant of life chances, inheritance and wealth transfers have actually taken on a new significance that well beyond the 1%. First of all, those transfers are becoming key mechanisms for across-the-board social stratification, and not just a way for the very wealthiest to pass on their wealth to their children. So one of the things that we do in the book then is to highlight these new mechanisms of social stratification. And secondly, in the context of sustained asset appreciation, intergenerational transfers have actually taken on a distinctive speculative dimension. So inheritance is no longer a kind of passive transfer of money that occurs following, for example, someone's death. Instead, they become a series of strategic decisions regarding how to position one's children in the asset economy, with beneficiaries not just receiving a one-off lump sum payment, for example, but an actual opening into the wealth effects of asset ownership. So what we argue in the book then is the millennial phenomenon is so important, not because of a shared experience of lockout, but precisely because it's in the millennial generation where the fault lines engendered by the asset economy are becoming increasingly visible. So really, what we've tried to highlight in the book is that there are distinctive political constituencies emerging in the asset economy, and that's made really explicit and very clear in the millennial generation. So I'll leave my comments there and hand back to you, Phil.
Phil, you're muted. Phil, you need to unmute.
I did it again. Okay. I'm fascinated by the choice of Minsky. You talk in the book about a Minskyan household versus a Keynesian household. And of course, I know Minsky for the reason Martin mentions the financial instability hypothesis, which is the one that everybody brought out during the crisis. But in fact, he's much more interesting as a kind of pointer of what institutionalist economics could have been if it hadn't been banished by neoclassical economics. In America, you had Thorstein Veblen, who would write a book like The Theory of Business Enterprise, where they would sort of ask, how do people run their businesses? Where do they get money and so forth? You don't get that from economists anymore. You'd have to go to business writers to get that. A good one like Martin Meyer or something, if I want to find out what happened to the stock market for about 20 years. It's like reading the Balzac of finance, you know. And then Minsky has this whole sequence of different types of capitalism, from commercial capitalism to finance capitalism to managed welfare capitalism to money manager capitalism. That's all based on where people get their money. Even though, for example, in the economics textbooks, it always says, if you want money, you go to the stock market and do an IPO or something like that. Well, sometimes you do. It's just that happens to be not that sort of time. And you've brought up the whole Minsky's notion that every person or every family is a bank that operates as under a liquidity constraint. They have a certain stream of debt that they will never pay off, but they have to keep ahead of it. So that's the liquidity constraint. You know, he even says that everybody can issue money. It's just a question of getting people to take it. So it's with suddenly vision, this whole household, which is using itself and various elements of the house as collateral to kind of keep going because the wages won't suffice for doing that. Could you expand a little more on this Minskyan versus the Keynesian household contrast as
Do you want me to have a go? Yep, Martin. So thanks so much for, it's a really good question. And I think here, the whole notion of the Minskyan household has come about through this really interesting coming together of myself and Martin in particular, because with Martin's work on Minsky and my work on households, we've been able to think about this in a really creative way. But so the whole idea of the Minskyan household is to understand the household in the context of the asset economy as basically a balance sheet entity, as Minsky understood economic entities with assets and liabilities. So of course, in the Keynesian era, you know, the household functioned very much as the site of the reproduction of labor power and as a unit of consumption. With the shift to the asset economy, First of all, I think to understand the emergence of the Minskyan household, we need to understand the kind of temporality of assets, so that, you know, assets have a very particular temporal structure. To kind of get your hands on an asset, it's normally debt fueled, and it takes a kind of upfront investment, which is normally secured by debt. And we secure an asset in the hope that it's going to produce returns in the future. And so the idea that we've developed is that given the kind of imperative to secure assets, that the household is in this constant struggle to secure income streams to produce down payments on the asset. So in other words, to make regular mortgage payments, for example. And what's I think so helpful about this idea of the Minskyan household is it precisely, as you've identified, makes us focus on the liquidity dimension, and that households are, to be able to survive, and I think in the book we talk about liquidity being the lifeblood of the household. Liquidity has to be secured, and that, you know, in part can be is most commonly through income from wages. But as we know, wages have stagnated, work has become more contingent. So there's a struggle for liquidity. And I think that understanding the household in this way, and the shift from the Keynesian household to the Minskyan household, can help us also understand how governments increasingly, and central banks, really aren't interested in what we would normally identify as kind of macroeconomic policy, but so for instance, employment policy, but are increasingly focused on keeping asset holding households afloat. So for instance, we saw that really clearly during the COVID period with, for instance, the kind of mortgage holidays and so on that banks gave property owning households. So there was a potential liquidity problem for asset holders during the COVID period. And banks and other institutions of credit stepped in to ensure that those households didn't go under, and which also gives us an understanding of the kind of political power of the asset holding constituencies. So I think the Minskyan household both conceptually enables us to understand the dynamics of households a great deal more accurately than notions of the Keynesian household, but also it helps us understand empirically what's going on with kind of central bank policy, housing policy, employment policy, and so on. So we just think that the notion of the Minskyan household gives us a much better handle on what everyday struggles in the asset economy feel like, look like. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Martin.
Well, so perhaps just to add a couple of things, I would say that, like, the difference between, it is also possible to think of the Keynesian household as a kind of balance sheet entity, but the Keynesian household was very much premised on the idea, was premised on an indexation of wages to property values and the size of mortgages. So, obviously there's a lot of myth about this, the post-New Deal era, but still, a Keynesian household would have been able to sort of pay off a mortgage on the basis of just sort of an average employment situation. in the neoliberal era, that has completely disappeared. So people, there's no assumption that an average job will allow you to buy an average house. That notion of a middle class existence has gone completely by the wayside. People need to sort of over leverage so much and then become dependent on capital gains for refinancing. At the same time, employment has become much more precarious. So, instead of a steady situation that works according to its own rules, and we have this constant management of inflows and outflows, and that's where the liquidity constraint becomes such a thing. And Minsky calls this somewhere a survival constraint. Like if you may have the best asset in the world and it's going to be worth like 10 times more in 5 years from now than it is now. But if you can't hold on to it, if you can't make the payments, then you just have to sell it and you lose out on all that, out on all those benefits. And that logic, in a way, is dependent, is at work in the the way people navigate housing markets. You might even be able to keep up with the mortgage payments, but you just don't have the down payment, so you'll never break into the market. And then perhaps one other thing to add was that I think basically what we're saying in the book is that, just picking up on Lisa's point about the political constituency, is that what has become too big to fill, where I was, thinking about associating that word or that expression with large banks or hedge funds having massively overextended themselves and then getting into serious trouble. But in a very meaningful way, I think that it is, that upper middle class constituency of homeowners that is now sort of, contracting by the very logic of rising house prices, that is some kind of too big to fill constituency. They can't be allowed to go under, and that's why you see those measures. Certainly here in Australia, we've kind of documented that quite clearly, that it's not just that when people lose their income that they're not forced to, there's no means testing in those kinds of situations. It's not as if people are forced to dip into the wealth that is in their house. It's actually completely the flip side of that, the opposite of that. It's that people are giving money so that they do not have to sell their house, and thereby we can forestall the kind of deleveraging movement that might occur if people really needed to put their houses on the market en masse. So I think these are some of the themes that really, swirl around this idea of the Minskyan household.
This opens up a lot of questions about debt, about risk, and so forth, which I hope we're going to get to later. I want to open it up to our first mystery guest this evening, Lee-Claire Laberge, who many of you know as the author of Scandals and Abstraction and Wages Against Artwork. She, of course, is a cultural critic who writes a lot about finance. So, Lee, ask your question.
Hi, it's great to see you all, and congratulations on the new book, Martijn and Lisa. I'm interested in Martin, your suggestion that the asset has sort of replaced the commodity as a kind of heuristic for transposition from the economy to society. And I know that, this is now coming from a cultural critic. I know that you guys are talking about the household, and you've convinced me of the importance of the asset as a sort of conceptual form with which to think the economic present. What I'm wondering is, can you sort of offer suggestions on where you see a kind of cultural logic of the asset at work? So a sort of interpretive or hermeneutic sort of ramification of the asset into various kind of cultural forms that wouldn't be precisely indexable to things like mortgage rates, central banking, so on and so forth. And I'm thinking about this in the context of the the work that the commodity form has long done in sort of cultural and literary studies to, interpret, to transpose from something strictly economic to something cultural, based to superstructure, if you will. I mean, it's a very speculative question, but I'd be really interested to hear you speculate.
Thanks. That's a super interesting question, and one that I've been trying to work on a little bit, because I do think those things are there. But just to perhaps take one step back, if we're sort of this shift of analytical lens from the commodity to the asset, it's not, the claim is very specifically that, it's not that, because we were often asked it, do you really think that like things like work and plain commodities and material production do not count anymore? And our answer is always like, no. It's just that in fact, for a large part of society, these things are an increasingly important lifeline. Our point is simply that it's no longer the kind of the linchpin of social integration that it might have once been, in the sense that it does no longer by itself offer middle-class membership. So that I think a lot of the commodity logics that we're seeing, we're kind of suggesting, well, you might get at an interesting aspect of them if you sort of reconceptualize those through the idea of the asset. Meaning that people who cannot get into the asset economy are effectively suffering a devaluation of their assets, their human capital, or their, whatever it is that they bring to market, as it were. So once you start thinking about that in terms of, appreciation and devaluation, I think it opens up a way of thinking about current transformations that is a little bit more in tune with sort of the cultural take that you would want to put on that. So like right now I'm seeing a lot of debates that look at human capital, like the Amazon restructuring of the world. And this has become very associated with debates about like neo-feudalism and those kinds of things. And to my mind, those kind of miss the point. I don't think this is some sort of regression to an older system, or we're not ending up in a feudal system. I think this is actually very much comprehensible within these kinds of terms. The de-skilling of labor, the devaluation of labor, and the appreciation of other assets are are flip sides of the same coin. And I think then, to finally circle around to your question, I think that finds expression in, and I would want to go here to notions like Lisa Baratzer's notion of enduring time, time that no longer flows, or other people who have written about this, notions like chronic time, time that doesn't work for us as well anymore as it used to. It's lost its sense of progress. I'm also thinking about this book by Jane Elliott that you probably know, which is all around the, like if you don't have liquidity, if you don't have time, then you end up in situations where you have to constantly you're forced to make decisions from, when only bad options are on offer because you can't write it out. And so I think that, to my mind, would, be the link into a more cultural studies or literary register. But I suspect that we'll hand over to Lisa. I'm curious, like, what she has to add to this, actually.
Thanks, Martin. Actually, I was going to also bring up Jane Elliott's book. I think it's called The Microeconomic Mode, which looks at particular cultural texts, films, and so on, precisely in terms of notions of what happens in a context where you have to bet on the future, but that future is all about uncertainty, you know, and the options that you have, none of them seem particularly appealing. So I think your question is a really awesome one, and it's something that we do address in the book, but when we talk about these particular authors, and we're also interested in the ways in which a particular affective condition or atmosphere is said to kind of connect to the millennial generation, and the ways in which that affective register is kind of connected to precisely these new class dynamics that we've talked about. So, you know, I think that you've opened out a really interesting question. There's a huge amount of work that could be done here potentially. And to my mind, it kind of translates to, you know, what's the cultural expression of the asset condition? One of those is through a sense of time. I mean, because one of the things that we make really explicit in the book, and the part I think I most enjoy about the book, is the temporal dimension of the asset economy and how that's distinct from a kind of commodity-based economy. So that, you know, the asset economy is about investing in the now in the hope of future returns, whereas, you know, the commodity economy, to put this a bit too simply, is much more presentist and probabilistic. So I think I think the answer to your question is probably lies in his temporality. I mean, I think that's the cultural register through which the asset economy is felt. It's a particular sense of time, the kind of both the urgency around time of needing to do something but not being quite sure what the thing to be done is, because knowing full well, for example, that the promises that were previously attached to human capital investment are completely broken, for example, knowing that an investment, you know, an investment in property is a leveraged property is completely risky in the context of searching for that constant liquidity. So I think the answer is around time.
But you also say that most of these assets are being continuously revalued every second.
Yeah.
It's not that they're investing in one future.
Yeah.
It's that all sorts of possible futures keep looming into view and fading away depending on how the market keeps going day by day. So, I mean, it's a fascinating, your notion of temporality, I was hoping we'd get to that at the end, because that's the sort of most profound metaphysically interesting aspect. Let's put that aside and come back to it now. We can get to it through debt. I think Stephen had a question about debt, which might take us to the questions of risk and temporality, which are fascinating in your framing of them.
Okay. I wanted to, I guess, ask about the way, how do I say this? Different types of debt, as well as the ubiquity of debt, but I think it also does loop back to this question about time, which I got a very interesting sense of from Lisa's previous book, The Time of Money. But in terms of debt, it seems that on the one hand, obviously this asset economy involves debt. Nobody has enough money to actually, very few people have enough money to actually buy the house outright, or for that matter, buy a car outright. So you're continually have mortgages and loan payments on your car and things like that. But in addition, there's a general sense that just as jobs and employment no longer give you enough money to pay a down payment on a house, they also don't give you enough money to just keep up with the stream of commodities that you buy and consume and run through from day to day, month to month, year to year. And so that's why there's been this incredible rise in consumer debt, like with Visa cards and Visa MasterCards and things like that. So we seem to have, one thing we seem to have is have multiple streams of debt, but which are very different prices, because mortgage debt is much lower, much more money, but it's much lower percentage, interest than credit card debt. So it seems like one thing is that the people who have the assets pay much lower payments on their debt than the people who just need to go into debt to buy groceries or furniture or whatever. So that seems to be another important, the way of these different types of debt work, but also the sense that this is again something I got from Lisa's book, The Time of Money, how you're never going to pay off your debts. Nobody's ever going to pay off their debts. And the banks or whoever owns the debts doesn't even necessarily want to get back all the debt. They just want to constantly roll over and refinance and continue have a continuing money stream coming from debt servicing. And so this seems to, so I'm wondering how the ubiquitousness of that, which is something I've gotten from Lisa's earlier book, relates to the ubiquitousness of the assets through the fact that these different types of debt seem to have very different costs to them. With, as usual, the poorer you are, the higher cost you have to pay. So, and that might, maybe I'll ask later how that leads back to questions of time, which I think it does, but if I could just get, just be interested to hear about that.
Thanks, Stephen. That's great question. And I think you're absolutely right. There's different kinds of debt. A mortgage debt is, as it were, good debt, in the sense that it's a kind of privileged kind of debt with much more favorable conditions than, say, personal debt, credit card debt, and the like. I think one of the things that's both common to the time of money, which you mentioned, and to the asset economy is this idea that it's very much a critique of the multitude of work that's out there now on claiming that we simply live in a debt society. Of course, we live in a society with a lot of debt. The asset economy, you're right, the fuel of the asset economy to a large extent is debt, especially mortgage debt. But only focus on debt alone ignores the Minskyan balance sheet, right? The liabilities and debt, and the fact that you can be in kind of a lot of debt, but actually have equity, and that you can leverage equity on, say, an indebted mortgage household to release money. So there are definitely different forms of debt. I completely agree with you, and a political economy of those different forms of debt is really, really important. So in the asset economy, we're really clear that we want to see current society not as a debt society, but as an asset society or as an asset economy, precisely because of the balance sheet effect. So I think that most writers who simply look at debt and there's a kind of moralism, I think, about a lot of the writing on debt, that it's a terrible thing, it's a bad thing, oh my goodness, look how much it's rising, and there's all these quantifications of debt. The debt society thesis ignores the fact that most debts are fueling assets, right? So I think that would be the first point. And the second point is that you're absolutely right, that there's a really, really important distinction to be made between different kinds of debt. And that in the asset economy, certain debts can actually lead to you being underwater. One of the examples that we used in the book is student debt, particularly in the US. And we're increasingly seeing a similar trajectory of student debt in Australia and the US and the UK as well. So, you know, that kind of indebtedness, which was, you know, was promised in a human capital register. You know, if you invest in your education, it will yield returns in the future. It just hasn't worked out for many people. And I think one US author, I've forgotten his name now, talks about the broken promises of human capital. So, you know, I think one of the things that we highlight in the asset economy is that it's housing, where the promise of the asset economy has kind of lived out, and that's because the housing built on a kind of Keynesian foundation around housing, and that's where wealth has been, can or could be built up through a cross-section of society. But I think, you know, a focus only on debt alone will not lead us to understanding the full dynamics of the asset economy, and that if we're talking about debt, we also need to understand what that debt is fueling and whether it's fueling an asset, which is also leading to capital gains.
But
can I just add one thing? Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Can I just add one thing that I think might be useful? So going back to this question about like, well, you know, why are people paying like 20% on credit cards and like 3% on a mortgage, or perhaps a bit more, but you know, why are these rates so different? And I think that has something to do with how this, so we argue, and I partly made this point first in my Capital and Time book, that, you know, too big to fail and buy out is not some sort of, you know, exception to the rule. It's really at the core of how neoliberal financial governance works. You know, it is too big to fail is not a breakdown of financial governance, it's how it works. But then the too big to fail principle works out in very differential ways according to constituencies. So, you know, like the Wall Street banks often get bailed out, you know, relatively few questions asked, just because the damage that their failure could do is just so enormous. And then when you look at these kinds of other groups, I think you can see similar principles at work. So even though, you know, yeah, of course, the quantitative easing never trickles down as much as we'd like, but it does trickle down enough to keep mortgage rates relatively low. And that has to do with the fact that if large numbers of people were going to default on their payments and had to sell their house, this is a massive problem in terms of economic growth, but also social legitimacy and stability, etc. And I think that is different for interest, the debt and interest that is owed on credit cards or student debt. You know, these are still sizable constituencies, of course, but first of all, you know, as we talked about earlier, the devaluation of human capital in the student area is kind of part of the model. But perhaps more to the point is that, you know, the enforcement mechanisms are such that there's no real danger in imposing 20% interest payments, in imposing a 20% interest rate on mortgage card debt. Sorry, getting all the terms confused, on credit card debt. Because clearly companies and collection agencies have become extremely adept at collecting those amounts of money, garnishing wages, etc. And so, you know, like there's a clear different, you know, people are treated according to different criteria.
Yeah, I think your political economy of this is really astute. I mean, there seem to be two levels, but both levels, both constituencies are part of the people that vote to keep the current neoliberal order in place for somewhat different reasons. The people who are struggling with their credit card debts and their house are never going to pay them off. But they have the emotional logic to capitalism to such an extent that they think they might be able to do it tomorrow. And they think it's with the structural forces are within their control. That's what the emotional logic, by throwing everything back on the individual and saying it's on you, in a certain way it empowers them. It's not saying it's not your fault, there's a structure out there that you can't do it. What happens with the debtors who are BlackRock, JP Morgan, or even people who can get big money, is they can leverage a huge amount, which is what you need to make a lot of money. No one in the credit card debt category or in the house debt category is ever going to make a lot of money off their debt, even though presumably they can leverage a certain amount from their house to buy another house or do it. Somehow it rarely works as a way. People who make a lot of money buy apartments that have, apartment houses that have 200 units in them, and that skim off a bunch on the top. And you need a lot of money to do that. Or they build new stuff on lots, which takes time, so they have to be able to bridge that. But they're also in a position, some of them, particularly if they're too big to fail, if they're brokerage houses, where they'll get bailed out, or they have access to loans at very low rates because of quantitative easing and something like that. So essentially our bold Schumpeterian entrepreneurs are taking really less risk than these other people who are just staying in their house is more of a risk for them than going after these things. So someone has a question, which I think, I gave sort of my answer, but how does the struggle for liquidity square with the slow constraints of fixed assets like houses? Does this primarily affect various groups of middle-class homeowners and small business owners, or is the liquidity struggle you talk about more specific to large asset holders like JP Morgan, Chase, and BlackRock? Also, I think I'll combine this question. Someone says, doesn't the importance of the asset as a source of non-wage income rest on the fact that social wealth is and remains commodified and new sources of money parallel to the wage are needed to survive? I mean, yeah, you talk about that. Essentially, in other words, it's an entirely new situation that everybody is put in because of this particular approach to an asset economy at all levels, right? I mean, it's
Yeah. So just still reading over the question, but so the first part, I would say that so here I would say, the slow constraints of fixed assets. I think that's a very high finance view of what a fixed asset is. You buy something and then it gives you a nice stream of revenue over time, which doesn't really match on very well to the like the fairly panic-driven purchase of a house that people might and debt-driven purchase of a house that people often are not entirely sure they'll be able to afford. So often a lot of it's premised on capital gains coming in very quickly, somebody getting a better job. So I would say that yes, liquidity is crucial at the level of high finance, JP Morgan, BlackRock, etc. But the difference is that, if the market's going up in the world of high finance, liquidity is not an issue, So liquidity only becomes an issue when the market freezes. That's, which was very apparent during the GFC. But I would say that in the asset economy, for regular people buying a house with a ton of debt, liquidity is always an issue, whether the market's going up or down. Like it's kind of the stress of life. I mean, of course, there are always exceptions. Like, if you've got wealthy parents, then that problem disappears to a large extent. But otherwise, I would say actually it generalizes that condition that we associate with high finance, the importance of liquidity. yeah, reading the second question, but perhaps I'll pass to Lisa for some.
Thanks, Martin. I hope I can answer this second question. I'm not quite sure I understand it that well. I mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean by social wealth remaining commodified. But I mean, there's plenty of work, I think, that's starting to show what you're meaning by social wealth. Things like I'm presuming you're meaning what we used to term the reproduction of labor power, care labor, and so on. Is that, I'm thinking that's what you mean, that remains commodified. I mean, I think that we have this section in the book where we talk about some interesting writers who have talked about a kind of split in society opening up between those who can live a kind of asset-driven speculative life and those who remain in a kind of commodified life. Or even as a kind of form of protest or resistance, will attempt to choose to live a commodified life. And our argument in the book actually is that it's that given that we live in an asset economy with an asset logic, is that it's very difficult even to choose to live a commodified life. So, for instance, if you refuse to become a property owner and are renting, it's highly likely that you're renting from a landlord whose property is an investment property and who will be gaining in the form of capital gains, and that your rent is actually the income stream that's being paid to pay off the investment property's mortgage. So I think one of the interesting points that we make in the book is it's really difficult to make a distinction between a kind of speculative logic and a commodity logic in the context of the asset economy. And the point about the wage, I think, is really interesting. I mean, the argument that we put forward in the book isn't so much that, you know, the wage is utterly unimportant, but that the wage is being used now, wages are being used now for liquidity purposes. And we must understand that that's a kind of qualitative shift to compared to, say, how the wage was used in the Keynesian era. So, for example, as Martin's already highlighted, you know, mortgages in the Keynesian era were more or less indexed to working lives, and they were very much indexed to the male working body as well, it should be said, so that mortgages were timed to expire at the end of one's working life. So I think, you know, wages now have this new kind of function. They fuel the possible in terms of asset ownership. And it's that sense of the shift from the probable to the possible that's part of what asset society or the asset economy is all about. So, and I guess we need to think about wages differently as a consequence. So there was this very interesting moment in Australian society, for example, where through a national agreement, a national collective agreement, this is before the days of enterprise bargaining, workers agreed nationally to trade some of their wages to access to asset-based superannuation. So, and that happened around about 30 years ago. So what the wage is and what it does and how the wage functions has really shifted historically. And one of the things that we have been really strong about, I think all three of us in all of our separate bits of work and in our co-produced pieces, is that we always want to foreground the institutional aspects of those shifts as well. So that shift in the wage, for instance, was institutionally based in Australia. So I hope that's helped to answer the question. But new sources of money, I guess one of them would be basic income. And one of the really interesting debates, and it's not often framed in this way, is around how basic income, we could understand basic income as a kind of automated liquidity, which can be used as fuel for to create liquidity to keep people in the asset game. So the new sources of income in the context of the asset economy, I think that's a really interesting question.
We haven't talked about speculation. You have a very interesting take on that, where if you don't speculate in this economy, you lose. If you, in fact, operate as some have in the past of trying to save enough so you can take yourself out of the economy, you'll find yourself in a situation where you'll lose because your assets are subject to the volatility of the international market. So you can almost say that speculation is a capitalism of fear. I mean, apart from all those people who speculate, the people who take large leverage and are big corporations, there are other people who speculate out of fear of falling, out of fear of being kicked out, not having enough to remain in their houses, or whatever sort of semblance of a middle-class lifestyle, or even a lower middle-class lifestyle that they have. There's a very interesting book called We Have Never Been Middle Class by Hadass Weiss, who's an anthropologist. It's from Verso. And she critiques Piketty. She was here last year. From a slightly different angle. She basically says, look, land prices were stable in the 19th century. So it provided a certain security. But what you have are all these people in the 19th century. The middle class essentially comes out of the working class. They're people who somehow managed to extract a certain amount of money and put it aside, and then maybe buy a house or a cottage and retire early. So the purpose of getting all that money is not to work and make more. It's literally to not to have to work and get out. But the problem, that's a problem for capital, as we see in the pandemic, where the pressure to get everybody back to work, and this is a real good preview of what might happen if you had an adequate basic income, this incessant pressure, these accusations of laziness, the invocation of the Protestant ethic. Well, in this case, finance came along and provided, with its volatility, it took away the security of small amounts of property that could insulate people from the market and get them out of work. You know, yeah, if you're BlackRock, or if you're in the too big to fail, you basically don't run the kind of risk that people who are on the edges of just staying in their house do. So that sort of speculation there comes not out of greed, which we think of, but comes out of the desire to run in place and not fall further, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's completely right. Just pitching in here, I think that is the most problematic aspect, I think, of this constant notion that is being trotted out by progressive intellectuals and academics that that we need to go back to some sort of real economy that is governed by fundamental values and makes real things, etc. It's very nostalgic, strongly normative idea about what an economy looks like, and it really ignores what the neoliberal era has made abundantly clear, namely that there is no such baseline of absolute safety, that all values are likely to fluctuate in one way or another, and that the only safety you'll find, the only certainty is through uncertainty. It's about minimizing your uncertainty by making the right speculations. And then people are like, well, does that mean we have to go pick out Bitcoins? This all seems so random. This can't seriously be the route to meaningful economic security for me and my family. And that's, again, that's where the housing things come in. No, it's not about just making crazy bets on things. It's about, making speculative investments along with the rest of society, because that has become the new too big to fail constituency and will be supported. And I know a lot of people here in Sydney who just feel, we're not dying to buy a house, but the only reason they've started thinking about it is that because they know that in 5 years, or let's say in 8 years, and house prices have doubled again, they won't be able to anymore. So the sense of urgency and anxiety derives very much from the fact that, they see it happening. It kind of, you can only, at some point, the window for getting on that bandwagon just kind of closes, and that itself becomes a source of concern.
You have an interesting take on money, and I think I want to bring in our second mystery guest, Cheryl Vint. Cheryl, can you welcome back to Red May. Cheryl is, of course, a well-known critic of science fiction, author of Science Fiction for the Perplexed, among many books. And it's also, I think, with Stephen, part of a group that thinks about money in wild science fictional ways. Your take on money, as I read it, your writing collective anyway, is that it's ultimately self-referential. The search for a foundation underneath, money that's guaranteed by gold or that's guaranteed by anything, is not there. You have an interesting phrase, Lisa, I think it's in the Time of Money, you say, how do you define money? Money is something that sets something in motion. And I put that aside for my three favorite things about money, lines about money, which are Marx's money is your passport to society, or your passkey to society. You can't get in or do anything unless you have it. And then Borges, who says that money is a repertory of possible futures. But then this notion of money setting things in motion almost disqualifies the need for it to be based on anything. If you could throw whatever it is into a pool and it will start things stirring, and then, if it's a synthetic derivative, it seems to have some capacity of moneyness if it sets things in motion. I mean, that particular science fictional world of synthetic derivatives, and the fact that so many different entities can seem to create money, or something that comes close to money, or has moneyness. How do you see that world playing out? I mean, the general way, the argument that you contest is the notion that money is elastic, and this sort of procedure produces a stretch that is going to snap back and at any given moment produce the crash, which has been predicted 20 out of the last 3 times by the left. But you use the word plastic for this incredible capacity of money and the finance to just keep forming new assemblages and keep going far beyond when you think it should, by any notion of what you think fundamentally finance is. So and money. So address that a little bit, and maybe Cheryl, you have a money question, since I know it's something you talked about in economic science fictions and so forth. So we can start there.
So I have a question, but perhaps you would like to speak about money in response to Phil's question first.
Okay, let's do that. If you have something to say about money,
So was that question for me, Phil?
Yeah, well, for both of you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, look, I mean, thanks. It's a really interesting question. And it's true that that quote from me is correct. And I guess what I've been so interested in, and I know Martin's done work on this too, is the ways in which kind of progressive economists and sociologists and the like somehow think if we can reset what money is and anchor money back to, say, gold or Bretton Woods or the value of labor, somehow we can reset the whole of society. And as Martin just mentioned in regard to something else, this is an incredibly nostalgic understanding of our world, which is really problematic. One of the things that I've been really interested in, and I think what the asset economy book does as well, is to think about, you know, what does money do now? What does money do? Money gives us access to more money, but not in a commodification sense, as in a kind of Palladian sense, but money gives us access to, for instance, the potentiality of capital gains. It gives us access to, say, debt, which gives us the, you know, the potential to participate in the logic of speculation and to potentially gain in the increase our household wealth portfolio, for example, in the future. So my interest in money is from a very sociological point of view, and my sense of the question of money is we need to understand, as you know, social scientists, historians, science fiction writers and the like, that precise process in which money has changed. And the example I gave earlier, I think, is quite instructive here from the Australian case, where wages became indexed to the potential of financial gain, right, through superannuation. And that's a really good example of how money might set something in motion. So my interest is very much in the institutional configurations that have led to money being all about this process of setting things in motion. So I hope that answers your question, Phil. And shall I hand over to Cheryl? Or did Martin, did you want to add anything?
Okay, yeah, let me just one very quick observation. So I think the idea of money is self-referential is not that, it's not that that always works. It's not that money projects itself into the future and then comes back as a larger quantity of the same thing. So it can fail, very much so. But it's an argument against the idea that money is a neutral representation of some sort of real value that already exists. And that notion of a passive neutral representation is very baked both into the mainstream orthodox economic mindset, but also the progressive critical mindset, because yeah, people realize that there's all this speculative finance floating around, but what this is seen as a kind of a deviation from that simpler money economy, which is, you know, sort of based on the Minsky's village fair model, where, you know, money is just very simply a way to exchange things. It doesn't do anything of its own accord. It's neutral in Hume's term. So it's really an argument against that. So, you know, the all there is, you know, debt and repayment, and out of that arises money, and that actually also has very much to do with the amount of public support a currency is able to attract. And you see this throughout history. It's the current, you know, so many currencies have been issued and so many have, you know, not done well, you know, like they tend to become subject to inflation, or they just disappear altogether. It's the currencies that are backed up that become part of an organized banking system that is backed up by public authority and some variety of a too big to fail mechanism that become standard currencies, national currencies, if you will, that really sort of hold together the infrastructure of an economy.
I have a question here, which is, I very much agree with what you were both saying, Martin and Lisa, about this kind of nostalgic idea that money has to be tied to something real and that would be more stable and things like that. But it just seems that the way you've been talking about it sort of sidelines the real question, which is that how, I mean, the question of that this is what creates massive degrees of inequality between people who have access to the money and through the money and leverage to more money, and people who don't have access to anything. And more people are, you know, it's sort of like what's happened under neoliberals in the US, and I presume in other countries, is that a certain percentage of the foreign middle class has been able to leverage their assets and they're owning their own homes to be a little more affluent, while more and more people, on the other hand, are falling out of the middle class and back into this situation where they're constantly in credit card debt because their wages are not enough even to just reproduce their own standard of living without this continual borrowing against the future and then rolling over the debts infinitely and so on and so forth. So it seems to be important to try to think about how these coexist, and also what I agree with you entirely that the whole point of this is that money is not neutral, which is basically what neoclassical economics always says, but which, as you've pointed out, is often, unfortunately, all too much accepted on the left at all. But I mean, if you want to think in science fictional terms, since I'm a science fiction critic like Cheryl is how could money mutate into something very different if we don't have fundamentalist myths about money? Because otherwise it will just sort of reproduce the kind of class dynamics that we've seen happening in Western countries over the last 30 years.
Or to pose what I was going to ask as the last question, but it won't be tonight because we want to hear from Cheryl. Can there be communist money, or is that an antinomy or an oxymoron? In other words, I'm asking as a value form person who wants to abolish the value form, as opposed to someone who thinks there's something unproblematic about money when it becomes a store of value instead of some kind of a token. You know, the antinomy would be, of course, there can't be for communist money, but of course, in terms of allocating, you need sort of some kind of token. So you can't do it either way. I mean, that's where I am at it in this antinomy at the moment, but I'm interested in your take on that. Or we can put that as a science fiction challenge.
Sure.
I think that's a great science fiction challenge.
Cheryl, do you want to ask your?
So does that, yeah, I wasn't clear if that meant I could ask a question. So I don't really have a question about money, although the question I do have, I guess, is a little bit related to the work that I've done around money, in the sense that I'm interested in money as a social technology and how one theorizes money as shaping what kind of possibilities for organizing social life flow from the way one understands money and where its value resides, and the role that belief plays in securing the stability of a currency. But my question sort of stemming from my reading of your book, which I very much enjoyed, so thank you and congratulations on the book. And especially I thought it drew really needed attention to the question of the increasing role of inheritance in shaping class differentiated outcomes in a way that I really appreciated that analysis in the book. But I have two kind of related questions, or interrelated to each other questions. So one has to do with this question of the commodity form being anachronistic, as Martin said in his presentation. I think I want to resist that a little bit, the full sort of moving away from the commodity form, because, well, I do think there's lots of value by thinking in terms of the balance sheet model that you've argued, and realizing the role of assets as well, that not all debts are tied to an asset that would allow it appreciation. Some debts are just this credit card debt. And so I'm a little bit resistant to sort of fully switching into that language of the asset economy, because it seems to me there's such a substantial number of people that are included in that economy only through exclusion. So for example, the example of someone whose rent perhaps goes to fuel an element of the asset economy, but that is someone who has no relationships to assets themselves within this economy. And that's even someone who's in the position of being able to pay rent, which not everyone is. And so that folds in for me to my sort of larger question, which is about this question of the asset economy as a social logic, or neoliberalism as a social logic. And the question is really, what are the strategies for politics in this particular situation? And here I'm thinking in part of Quinn Slobodian's book, which outlines very clearly that neoliberalism, was deliberately imposed and cultivated as a logic that we were encouraged to believe in. So are there strategies for sort of delegitimating that or de-brainwashing us from thinking in terms of the asset economy? Imagining ourselves as human capital, for example, that's a very asset-driven way to think of yourself as an asset and things like that. And then that relates to my question of the intergenerational wealth transfer, that if we're going to think in terms of the asset economy, is it really two classes, the asset owning and the non-asset owning? Or do we have to develop a different rubric which maybe involves more than a binary to try to think about the class positions? So hopefully there's some coherent questions one can answer in that. And thanks for this opportunity to pose the question.
Questions in
This is truly awesome questions.
I know.
A whole bunch of them. So just try to work my way through a couple of them, and then I'll pass to Lisa, and hopefully together we can sort of, work out decent answers. So first of all, I actually agree with what you said about the way you described very eloquently, actually, sort of where the commodity economy sits in our scheme, as it were. So we're not saying that there is no commodity economy anymore. We're just trying to suggest that this is not like, there's a commodity and an asset economy, as if these are existing alongside each other. Like, I think you're very right to say that the commodity economy is very much becoming the sphere of those who are excluded from the asset economy. And I think my perhaps somewhat polemically charged notion that the commodity economy is anachronistic, there might be exaggeration, but is really to say, well, the driver here is the asset economy. This is not sort of two things sitting next to each other and sort of, vying for dominance. No, this is very much driven by the asset economy. And so, yeah, the commodity economy is, from that sense, is perhaps analytically becoming a little bit secondary, even though I realize that this determines the life chances of, like millions of people. So it's not a way to say it doesn't matter, but just to shift the focus. Then strategies for politics. So it's interesting that you mentioned Quinn Slobodian's book, which is sort of very much part of that thinking about neoliberalism that is very focused on the ideas of neoliberal thinkers, their organizational acumen, how they've been able to sort of push these things into the debate. And so it's a fairly top-down narrative of how neoliberalism came into being. And, while I have a lot of appreciation for that work, I think in our book, we suggest a slightly different angle, which is more to do with how neoliberalism, whatever its sort of, crazier ideas and its excesses may be, it has also been a more reflexive attempt to shore up a home-owning middle class after the turmoil of the 1970s. So that we're just a little bit more interested in that sort of middle part, rather than in how neoliberal schemes have, led to the enrichment of the 1%, which we don't disagree at all with. That's definitely happened. But what underpins this? What allows this sort of to go on? And for us, that's definitely the fact that, at least a large part of the population has been to some extent able to buy into this logic. So again, it's moving away from that Piketty story, and then so still on the politics, I guess circling back to your question to Phil's question about, what does money look like in a socialist society? So to me, it's very difficult to imagine that you would have a symbol like that regulates society, that doesn't do things. I think the idea that you can have a representation that is entirely neutral, that can't be manipulated, or that people can't position themselves around in ways that, you know, allow them to capture the work of others, or, you know, I think that that's very difficult to imagine for me. So it's not so much about, I think, you know, does money exist in a socialist society or not? It's more about, you know, what are we going to do about the too big to fail tendencies that would inevitably arise? So just an example from the, like right now, the modern monetary theory is very popular. To me, that is to a large extent premised on this fantasy that we can have a neutral money. But so you know, in that sense, I don't really agree with the thrust of the of their critique. But that doesn't mean that, you know, I can't support a lot of the political things they have in mind, like a basic income, or you know, like breaking, you know, like splitting up the banks, you know, those kinds of things. Ultimately, it's you know, like the fact that money is this sort of ethereal thing is, you know, we need to know that in order to sort of be able to position against ourselves against it in relation to it. But that doesn't mean that it's the key lever in a way for getting to a better society. There are institutions that need to be dismantled or tackled.
You have an interesting title in your South Atlantic Quarterly intro. It's Contingency and Foundation. We've talked a little about foundation, and in fact, the regressiveness of looking for a secure foundation, or the nostalgia of trying to go back to something where everything was grounded, as opposed to trying to figure out what we are and what we're living with, and how to push that towards some state where it would work for everybody instead of just a few. The contingency, I think, is what distinguishes your approach to neoliberalism, the arrival of neoliberalism, from various standard stories, whether it's the simple one of it was a business counterattack that was just introduced. I think what the notion of contingency gets is that it seems to me that in the 70s, as I remember and think back, nobody really understood, nobody could have understood in advance how effectively popular neoliberalism would be. If you said, we're going to give people nothing, we're going to take it away and say, it's all on you, the risk is going to be bracing, go out and make it, fella. You know, it sounds crazy, which is why all of these people from the Trilateral Commission or Daniel Bell, that we're talking about the post-industrial society, they thought it was over in the 70s after the 60s. They thought essentially, you know, it's all going to be downhill. We're going to have to share the wealth to some degree. We're going to be some kind of, you know, managed society and blah, blah, blah. The only people who didn't believe it were the Friedmanites and others who were nuts, who just kept pushing forwards. And when all that stuff started to happen and the reaction occurred and certain, let's say, assemblages formed and people could start to see how that was working, and then it started to come together as an ensemble and became something that was adopted afterwards when one could start to see pragmatically what its effects were. That's the sense I get from reading your work, which I essentially agree with. You know, and it allows both Quinn Slobodian's vision to be part of it too. These people were working to create a polity where everything was put in a constitutional bell jar which couldn't be accessed, and there were rules which everybody had to adopt, and there couldn't be this constant democratic changing of things. You know, there were economic rules of the road or whatever. All of the various versions of, and the business counteroffensive in America really did happen, you know, with the Powell letter and all the stuff that Kim Phillips Fine writes about in Invisible Hands or Visible Hands, the book about that. But there was a lot of luck and contingency in it when it came together. And, you know, in the sense that even when Althusser talks about capitalism coming together by a bunch of swerves of rain coming down where atoms cohere that didn't have to and may not have, but did, you know? So
this is very interesting. I completely agree with everything you just said. I think we, you know, I almost feel that only now are people becoming a little bit attuned to the way in which neoliberalism as a paradigm or the market as a symbol has resonance with democratic culture. And I think for a long time, critical thinkers have only, you know, well, they've been looking for like, well, when this is going to end, like, you know, just like in my emotional logic book, I refer to like Lash, right? Like who already saw this whole thing crumbling even before it even started. And there's, you know, neoliberalism gets a new lease of life every time. And I think critical thinkers have not done themselves any favors by constantly going to neoconservatism as the explanation. Like there's always like, well, neoliberalism by itself is unviable. It offers nothing exciting for people. It's only its unholy alliance with neoconservatism that has allowed it to persist. I think that's one thing. And then the other thing, the other side of that is that so many thinkers are just like very used to thinking by professional training in terms of, you know, democracy versus capitalism. Like, you know, this is very much like what I think Polanyi's double movement is about, you know, like it's society and democracy against capitalism. So that makes it very hard to conceptualize how, you know, neoliberal capital has wormed its way into the infrastructure of everyday life.
Yeah, I do want to add, though, that this is a cruel attachment to neoliberalism. It ultimately can't, even though it is a point where most of the risk has been shifted downward, the great risk shift. And at the end of the day, it sort of eats away and corrodes. That doesn't mean that it will undo this cruel attachment to the belief that you have the power to reverse it. Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of my life. I own everything that happened and I will do it. And all of the tropes that neoliberalism offers, and then also occasionally, as in the case, for example, you give of Thatcher saying to workers, you can buy your own council houses. You know, everybody thinks, gee, that's good. You know, there are a few crumbs and things that come along, but I don't say that everybody is going to be pushed into a kind of an absolute miserable state that it will spark a revolt. One doesn't know how much that can go on. It can go on, but I also say that it is not something that fulfills.
But if I may, like, I never meant to imply that there's not a role of contingency in neoliberal logics working out to the ways they intended. In fact, that's part of the story, right? Is they had these ideas for many years and were considered fringe until they were able to take advantage of certain crises situations. But that's kind of my point, that it was a political project first that then structured the economy in an image that enabled continued accumulation in that model and found ways to seduce people into belief in it. And so that's sort of the question of like, well, what are the politics to undo that, to enable other kinds of beliefs to take hold, and what kind of policy or other legislative structures do we need to push towards to undo the ones that neoliberals were very successful in instantiating?
Can I just add to that? And that's a great point, Cheryl, thanks. I mean, the example that you've given in the chat, Phil, about Thatcher's sell-off of council housing or social housing in the UK, which happened really early, you know, in the late 70s, from the late 70s onwards. This was critical politically. So at that point in time, there were fewer than 50% of owner occupiers in Britain. In other words, people who own their own homes. by selling off the good quality council housing, I should add, that shifted the owner occupancy rate to over 50%, which meant that it changed the political landscape in Britain. So the ways in which, again, it returns us to the centrality of housing in this picture, and for neoliberalism as a political project, that the housing question is key. And to return, and housing, is an ontological thing. It gives people a sense of security, talking about feelings and affect and so on. Housing is critical here. And to return to your earlier question, I don't think I ever got a chance to respond to, Cheryl, where you said, is it too simple to see asset owners on the one side and non-asset owners on the other? And there's a simple binary. I completely agree. It's much more complicated than that. And in the book, we try to produce a much more nuance. We actually call it a class scheme or a social stratification scheme, which I think has about 8 or 9 different points of differentiation. So I completely agree that we need to really think about the relationalities involved in terms of asset ownership and non-asset ownership.
There's a question for you, Lisa, in the chat, which I'll read out loud so people can hear it. One of the things Lisa brought up is a sense of urgency and an urgent temporality specific to discerning risk and stable investment streams. But you both point to ubiquitous over-leveraging in the asset economy. In appealing to Minsky and Minsky households, the figure we haven't really heard much about is crisis. Cultures of over-leveraging are often portrayed as the cause of economic crises, but is biting off more than you can immediately chew rather a symptom of shifts from commodity to asset economies as you see it?
Thank you for the question. So by biting off more than you can chew, I'm assuming the question is about over-leveraging in households. And I guess, first of all, it's really important to point out that the kind of securitization of mortgages enabled what we might think of as over-leveraging. So for instance, debt-to-income ratios that we didn't see in the Keynesian era, where the amount of debt you could take on was more or less had to be indexed to 3 or 3.5 times your wages. Now we see 9, 11, 12, up to 15 times. And the issue is, as we've said, not the kind of quantum of debt, but the ability to create liquidity to be able to manage that debt, to make regular payments. And it's really interesting that you're bringing up this notion of crisis, because what's so interesting about the housing market, and every time we think there's going to be a crisis, of course, the too big to fail logic steps in, as Martin's termed it, to create a kind of bailout situation. And I mean, there's a guy called Steve Keen, who you might have heard of, who's an economist, who's Australian, I believe, and he's predicted the Australian housing market, and especially the Sydney housing market, is going to collapse, I think, is it 17 times or something like that? And it's never happened, right? So what's so interesting is after the GFC and throughout the COVID crisis, what we've seen is these endless kind of narratives of, we've reached the end game, we've reached the threshold, we've reached the tipping point. And precisely the logic of too big to fail has stepped in, and a crisis hasn't happened on the scale or type or form that people have predicted. So I guess I'd want to be wary of crisis narratives in regard to the asset economy. But of course, some individual households do go under. Of course they do, and we saw that after the GFC. But also, the thing we need to kind of balance that against is the number of households that don't go under. So I just think we need to be wary of a crisis narrative and actually situate this kind of question of over leveraging. there's no kind of real objective tipping point for households. It's all about liquidity, and situate that question of the kind of the leverage question in the bigger context of the too big to fail logic that Martin's alluded to. I think you're on mute, Phil.
I'm off it now. I have a question about the future, which is something you deal with in one of your many books. I can't remember which one, but in other words, there were popular slogans or books or even philosophical books saying that the future had been canceled or there's no future in terms of punk or so forth. And that had been linked to the idea that finance had eaten up the future by pledging away, by dealing in profits that had not been made and so forth. It left less future for people to have. Now, you have a quarrel with that particular formulation or various formulations, but first of all, I'd like to hear how you deconstructed that particular claim, and then to discuss a little bit. I know Steve has some thoughts about this. What is different about the future of someone graduating in 1970 and one who's graduating in 2019?
Now I'm on mute. That's a great question. And I guess the quarrel I had about the no future arguments, which are pretty ubiquitous actually in a certain kind of cultural type analysis, cultural studies register, is, I mean, basically my point was, yeah, well, maybe a certain kind of future is over, one that's kind of predictable and probabilistic, but actually what we have now are, in the asset economy, we have different kinds of futures unrolling and potentially in front of us, and that populate the horizon. And I guess I was identifying a certain kind of nostalgia in that kind of no future argument. And I mean, in terms of the kind of life cycle or life course question, this is really important and a really interesting question. So thanks for asking it. I mean, I guess the graduate from the 1970s, I mean, I finished my undergraduate degree, I think, in the late 80s. And the state paid all of my university fees. I had no student debt. I then went on to do a PhD that the state also paid for, had no student debt. So what's the difference now is that a graduate today would be stepping out into the world, so to speak, with debt. They've made an investment in their education. Is that investment going to pay off? We all know that investments in human capital have been increasingly devalued. So that kind of human capital is not working out in the way people intended. And to speak to kind of the concerns that Stephen's been raising across this session today, you know, there are strong class dynamics to that. So, you know, the parents who are going to pay off student debt for people, parents who are going to pay and fund an internship for their young adult children. Those kids are in a completely different position to, say, those who have graduated, whose parents are not wealthy, who are not going to help them with their student debt, and are certainly not going to be able to afford to pay for them to do an internship. But also, I think, you know, there's a change in when young adults can become independent. So if you look at the 1970s life course, it was a kind of Keynesian life course. You could move out of the family home pretty easily if you had a job. Mortgages were indexed to wages in a fairly straightforward way. You could buy a house that was reasonably priced. So I guess my point is that we need to understand that the asset economy has completely transformed, and this speaks to Cheryl's question as well, completely transformed the way we can live our lives and the ways in which social life is organized, you know, from what our wages look like to the kinds of jobs we can access to where we can live. I mean, Phil, you brought that up in the kind of pre-broadcast discussion that people in Seattle, the wages are so low that they're having to live miles and miles away from the city center and have to commute for hours to do their jobs. And also even things like retirement work at what used to be retirement ages. People would stop work maybe when they were 60 or 65. That's no longer the norm. And we can see these changes already. People are working into retirement. They're remortgaging in what used to be known as the retirement period, using equity that they can extract out of their property to fuel their children's attempts at getting into the property market and so on. So the way we try to think about that in the book is through the notion of asset-driven lifetimes. So I think the changes are multiple and they're huge, actually.
Yeah, my question is less what the changes were. I mean, I think many of us, know some version of it, but the two questions are, haven't you indentured part of your future, even though you can't know the future exactly, which is a point you make against, it's not that there was something that we had that we gave up, yet a certain amount of time in the future is going to be devoted to paying off that debt. That's one thing. And then the second thing, the very fact that you have to conceive of your education as an investment changes what it is. What's your approach, what you're listening to in every classroom and so forth.
I agree, but I know Martin wants to come in, but just to answer your first point, it's not simply about being indebted, it's also about increasing the value of assets. So so one isn't necessarily simply indebted into the future. You might be getting capital gains, but I'll turn over to Martin.
Yeah, sorry, just wanted to add one thought to this. So I think, perhaps I'm not speaking for Lisa here, but like personally, I don't have any difficulty with this idea of no future as a kind of a shorthand, right? Like, like some notion of progress has disappeared and we can capture that by saying that this future has been canceled. That makes sense. But I think, and what we're talking about then is actually predominantly what Cheryl just mentioned, the kind of the people who are difficulty getting into the asset economy, who live a more sort of, are servicing debts that only ever seem to grow, while their human capital only seems to devalorize. And it is that sort of thing that I can understand you would look at in terms of, well, like your future has been preoccupied in a way, right? Personally, my main issue with framing this thing in terms of the cancellation of the future is just that it doesn't really get at the way capital is still very adept at playing on futurity, if we call it that. So for me, when I think about how capital now works, it's like fully a provocation machine, right? Like, especially for people who aren't able to sort of make it into the asset economy. Like it's constantly demanding that we orient ourselves to the future, constantly demanding that we come up with constructive responses to situations that we had, not of our own making, and that, might feel very unfair. And I think that shift that shift in the workings of capital towards like provocations and speculative responses, that is not helpfully or effectively engaged by this notion of a stolen future. I think that is best seen as a, sort of a loss of hope, sort of an intellectual loss of hope that doesn't really engage with the the intensity with which we engage capital's emotional roller coasters, I would say. So that's personally my beef with the no future as a real sort of characterization of the current era.
Stephen, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, in reading both Lisa's and Martin's early books, which have time in the title, I was very struck by what you were both saying. But again, it's sort of like if conventional left cultural commentators are saying the future's been canceled, what you're telling us is no. In fact, the future is going to be fuller than ever, because every single second you have to run on a treadmill and reschedule your debt payments and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, I'm 67, but I can't retire because I have to get my kids through college, which they're young enough they haven't gone yet. So I feel like I do have a future. It's a future of being constantly on a treadmill. It's a future of never being able to just, my ideal of communism has always been Oscar Wilde saying, eat grapes and drink wine and read Plato, and just waste your time like that. And that's what's no longer allowed, it seems. And so maybe calling out cancer in the future is not the right way to put it, but it's kind of, that's how the future has been changed.
Cheryl, you have a thought?
Well, I mean, I take Martin's point about the capital continues to play with multiple futures, and in fact, sort of making sure it has bets such that whatever contingency comes to play, that profit is to be made, so that the future, I think, is a very active side of where how capital works right now, which is why I became interested in thinking about speculative fiction in the future. But I also think it's class differentiated whether the future is canceled or not, and that's maybe why these two things are both at play, because for a lot of people, I think the future does feel like it's already been occupied, it's already been scripted out. You're so constrained by this need to maintain liquidity to continue to service your debt that the future is like an eternal present from one kind of class-based experience. But nonetheless, the idea of the future is precisely what capital, especially in sort of venture capital and IPOs, is making profit from. So I think both are really at play.
Who was it? Alan Greenspan who said, people who own houses don't become communists. Maybe that's a thought to end on.
I think it was Thatcher, actually.
Oh, it was Thatcher. Okay. Two of our heroes, yes. I want to thank Lisa and Martin. I almost said for coming all the way from Australia, but maybe I'll be able to say those words someday in Seattle. But anyway, it's nice to talk to them over the ether here, and Cheryl for being a mystery guest from wherever in the universe. She is wandering now on her galactic cruiser, and Stephen, who is in Detroit, the eye of the hurricane in some ways. The city of James Boggs, which we visited a couple of times in 2 James Boggs events, and Lee Claire LaBerge for visiting too. Lisa and Martin and Melinda's work is so extensive and covers so many things that I have this sort of a note thing of things I want to ask them, but we're going to have other conversations to bring it all out. I do hope someday after you do your Sydney inquest and survey, you do a Seattle survey of Capitalism 3.0. It would be quite interesting to see how, to me anyway, how it goes out. So one and all, good night, and join us tomorrow. We have, let me even look on the calendar here, and I will repeat what the events are. Oh, I guess they're not here. Well, I know the, wait, is it Lux tomorrow at 3 o'clock, Mahim? No, I know at 6 p.m. we're having how to weaponize or diffuse a constitution with Aziz Rana and Camila Vergara and Richard Kreitner. Oh yes, and tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. we're having a conversation with Sandra Mazzadra in Italy and Jason Reed in Maine on Marx producing subjects. So lots of good stuff coming up immediately. Do give to Red May and join us on another one of our journeys. Thanks for listening.